G'day all. Welcome to today's Kirby Institute seminar series. My name is Mo. I'm a senior research fellow in the HIV Epidemiology and Prevention program and the group leader for the LGBTQ+ population health research group. Today, we are presenting on the land of the Bisexual people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, both past and present, and pay my respects to elders both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. The format of today's seminar will start with a presentation followed by a Q&A. If you're joining us online, you can ask your questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And for those of us in the room, there are two microphones on either end that will be turned on at the end of the seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Jack Freestone. Jack is a postdoctoral research fellow at the National Centre for Clinical Research on Emerging Drugs, known as NCCRED. Prior to this role, Jack worked at ACON, an LGBTQ+ community health organization, as the manager of the Bisexual men's sexual health programs. Jack also completed his PhD with us at the Kirby Institute, where I had the absolute joy and pleasure to be his PhD supervisor. In today's presentation, Jack draws on his collective experience to present on exploring and implementing community-led chemsex interventions. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mo. And thank you everybody for coming. As mentioned, my name is Jack Freestone, and today I'm going to be presenting on the work, the service development, the service delivery and research that was complete as part of my PhD candidature. I complete my PhD here with the Kirby Institute with the HEP program, and I did so while I was working full-time at ACON for a number of years as ACON's manager of alcohol and other drug programs, and then more recently as ACON's manager of sexual health programs for gay and bisexual men who have sex with men. So today in the presentation, I'm going to be talking about exploring and implementing community-led interventions for gay and bisexual men who have sex with men. There were two studies which comprised the primary data collection for my thesis, and these were the GHB Cultures, Practices and Experiences study and the Method study. I'm going to start the presentation by giving you a little bit more context for the research. I'll talk through some background and some of the evidence around chemsex specifically before I go on to detail the research methods, the findings and the translation. So by way of context, we started this program of research in 2020, and it's important for me to mention that throughout the 2010s in Australia, there was significant attention paid to crystal methamphetamine use. Crystal methamphetamine and the people who used it were the subject of national stigmatizing campaigns. And I've pictured on that slide the Ice Destroys Lives campaign, which some people here may remember. I guess a little closer to home for me personally and professionally was a focus on crystal methamphetamine use among gay and bisexual men for the express purpose of enhancing sex. In 2019, there was a special commission of inquiry into the drug ice in New South Wales. And at ACON, we put in a submission to that inquiry. And within our submission, we advocated for the expanded delivery of programs and services addressing chemsex specifically. And we advocated for these services in response to community concern, in response to the data, and also with a view to kind of leveraging the expertise that we developed over many decades of working in community and peer-led services in both alcohol and other drugs and sexual health. With that background in mind, we partnered with the Kirby Institute, with NADA, with St Vincent's Hospital, Sydney, with Positive Life, New South Wales, and we put in for an NHMRC partnership grant, which was successful, and that has really enabled a lot of the research that I'm going to be speaking to in the presentation today. Before I get on to the research, I'm going to give you a little bit more background and start with this discussion around terminology. Now, I'm using the terminology of chemsex when I discuss this research today, but I just want to acknowledge that when we're talking and working with community at ACON around this subject matter, we use a range of different terms, including party and play, PNP, sexualized drug use, or sometimes just partying. I think the term chemsex really prioritizes and centers the experiences of gay and bisexual men who have sex with men. But I just want to acknowledge that people of all sexualities and gender identities use drugs in combination with sex. In ACON's context, we know that the majority of clients who are accessing our alcohol and drug substance support counseling service are gay and bisexual men seeking to address their relationship with crystal methamphetamine. If we look at local research evidence from Sydney, we can see from the Gay Community Periodic Survey that about 11% of gay and bisexual men report using GHB within the previous 6 months. About 7.8% report using crystal methamphetamine within the previous 6 months. And we know from the Flux study that 85% of participants in that study who said they were using either crystal methamphetamine or GHB were doing so for the express purpose of enhancing sex. So I provide that data just to give you a little bit more context around our population of focus. But what is this experience of chemsex? There's a lot of research and media commentary that really characterizes this experience of chemsex as one which is sex facilitated by mobile hookup applications where participants use drugs in an Australian context, often crystal methamphetamine or GHB, to facilitate sex with multiple partners over a long period of time, where sexual practices are framed as kind of adventurous or inherently risky. Now, I think that conception of chemsex probably accounts for some chemsex that occurs, but it's not the whole picture. And just before I started my candidature in 2020, the team at the Centre for Social Research and Health had done some research among GBMSM using crystal methamphetamine. And that research really pointed out that people are engaging in chemsex in a range of contexts and relational dynamics, including in the context of monogamous and long-term relationships, and also that people who practice chemsex have an array of strategies at their disposal to mitigate risk. So when we lean too heavily on these ideas of chemsex, which really prioritize and center adventure and risk, I think we risk alienating the very people that we want to engage with our programs and services. So in terms of harm reduction practices that play out in chemsex settings, there's a range, and they extend to the choice and management of settings. So the choice of settings where you can carefully manage the measuring and timing of your dosage and the management of those settings to avoid hazards and risks. Practices around gatekeeping in terms of your partner selection, so vetting partners that you might party and play with, or partying with people only who are otherwise known, trusted, and safe. A range of practices related to this concept of temporality, which I think to me means like approaches to spacing out your dosing of drugs within a session, also spacing out your occasions of drug use to allow ample time for recovery, allowing ample time to prepare for a session and prepare to recover from a session. We know in this population that an uptake of biomedical HIV prevention, so PrEP and HIV treatment in Australia, has significantly mediated HIV transmission risk. We see strategies play out in the realm of communication, and that can be communicating about sexual interests and desires and limits and boundaries, as well as communicating about boundaries and limits around drug use. And then there's a lot of research about LGBTQ+ populations who use drugs, which documents cultures and practices of community care. And I think it's really encouraging in the chemsex space that we see those cultures and practices of care play out in chemsex networks as well. I think in part because of this range of harm reduction strategies, it's really important for us to acknowledge that not everybody who practices chemsex experiences harms. But I also think it's important that we acknowledge that there is a real potential to experience harm. And there's been a lot of research which has explored associations between chemsex and experiences of harm. A lot of the research explores harms related to HIV risk and explores associations between chemsex and HIV risk behaviors. But as I mentioned, sort of more recent Australian evidence and from the Flux study demonstrates that uptake of PrEP and HIV, that uptake of PrEP and biomedical HIV prevention really mediates HIV risk in a contemporary Australian context. Of concern is the transmission of bacterial STIs and the transmission of hepatitis C. Obviously, with chemsex, there's risks around hepatitis C transmission associated with both sexual practices and injection risks as well. There's a spate of research exploring chemsex and associations with acute harms, so things like overdose, injury, acute mental health incidents, and sadly, even death. The research around chemsex and associations with chronic mental health conditions is mixed. Some studies document a heightened prevalence of conditions like anxiety and depression among GBMSM who practice chemsex, while other studies document that there's actually a lower prevalence of anxiety and depression in this population. And they hypothesized that that might be because of the network formation and community connection benefits that are incumbent in participating in chemsex networks. And then finally, there's some research around sexual well-being, which is a term that I'm using to, I guess, connote research on experiences of sexual non-consent and sexual violence, but also on this kind of interdependent linked relationship between drugs and sex. So a reliance on drugs to engage in any sex at all. I need to mention GHB overdose because currently in Australia, we're seeing an increased rate of GHB use and GHB harms. So GHB, it's a central nervous system depressant. And what this means is it slows down messages traveling between the brain and the body. And it has a really narrow margin of error with your dosing between a dose which causes a kind of desired effect and a dose which might induce a loss of responsiveness or unconsciousness. It also, there's pronounced variability and tolerance to GHB among different people. There's differences in GHB batch strength. There's, the effects of GHB with other drugs that are also central nervous system depressants like opiates, benzos or alcohol. They compound the effects of GHB, and all these factors combined, I guess, exacerbate risk for overdose, which is why we see such a high rate of GHB overdose among populations of people who use GHB globally. In Australia, between the years 2012 and 2018, we saw a 147% increase in GHB-related ambulance presentations in Victoria. And more recently, we've seen a 115% increase in emergency department presentations related to GHB here in Sydney. I think it's this unique culture that surrounds chemsex and also this unique harm profile that causes many, I guess, community organizations and researchers to advocate for robust services to support people who are engaged in chemsex. And robust services are often advocated for in terms of, I guess, inclusive and affirming mainstream general population services, but also tailored interventions. And there isn't that much evidence on tailored interventions in the chemsex space. There's a handful of studies, most of which have been conducted in California and the US, where tailored programs and services for GBMSM using crystal methamphetamine have investigated the effects of like cognitive behavioral therapies, contingency management, and motivational interviews. And these interventions have been favorably evaluated against outcomes like HIV risk behaviors, mental health, and frequency of crystal methamphetamine use. Locally in Australia, we've seen a promising evaluation of ACON substance support counselling program, and in Victoria of Thorn Harbour Health's Rewired group program as well. Additional to evidence on these tailored interventions, I guess, is a commentary around what good service provision looks like for this population in the empirical research on chemsex. And I've, on this slide, included 3 different kind of principal recommendations. The first being that in acknowledgement that a lot of people who practice chemsex don't want to reduce or stop, that services really need to center and prioritize harm reduction education. The second being that services for people engaged in chemsex need to be culturally appropriate and recognize that people who practice chemsex can experience real barriers to accessing services. So it's suggested that services should be community and peer-led. And the third being that we need to acknowledge that with chemsex, we're working with a behavior that exists at the intersection of drug use, sexual health, sexual well-being, and mental health. And therefore services need to provide like appropriately interdisciplinary and interinstitutional care. I think these principles are really sound, but when I did my PhD lit review and looked at kind of what the evidence is around this, I noticed some gaps in terms of their actual application. Specifically, there was little evidence on community-based practices around GHB harm reduction. There was a wide range of programs and services being delivered by community organizations, which were community or peer-led, which were scarcely evaluated in the peer-reviewed literature. And there were many pieces of work which commented on barriers to service access, but few pieces of work which actually investigated service experiences. So with this in mind, and kind of with my ACON hat on as someone who was delivering services and researching them at the same time, I asked this question of how may community-led interventions best support GBMSM to manage chemsex? And we devised the following aims. The first was to characterize the evidence base surrounding individual level peer interventions for GBMSM. The second was to develop evidence to inform the delivery of interventions focused on GHB harm reduction. The third was to implement a peer-led Chemsex intervention and formatively evaluate it to inform its adaptation and its replication. And the fourth was to describe how GBMSM who practice Chemsex experience talk therapies delivered across general population and specialist settings. I'm going to talk through each of these aims, and I'm going to spend most time talking about aims 3 and 4, just because aims 1 and 2 have been presented previously. The research that I'm going to talk to really exists in the realm of applied qualitative research, but particularly against aim 3, we also borrowed some concepts and frameworks from implementation science. So aim 1, we addressed aim 1 via a scoping review of individual level programs for GBMSM that have been published in the literature between the years 2000 and 2020. What we saw in this scoping review was that there are an array of efficacious peer-led programs for GBMSM, and peers were delivering work across modes of delivery spanning peer-led counseling programs, peer group work programs, peer navigation services, and peer education services as well. A lot of these interventions in the literature had an explicit focus on HIV, but they also included intervention content relevant to AOD and mental health and psychosocial well-being as well. The evaluations of these interventions nearly always primarily prioritized HIV-oriented outcomes, HIV prevention, testing, and treatment. And rarely did they evaluate impacts on things like AOD use and mental health or psychosocial well-being. I guess the key takeaway from this scoping review was that we have decades of experience in the delivery, the development, implementation, and evaluation of peer-led programs for GBMSM and HIV. We know that GBMSM experience disparities in other health and well-being domains, and we can leverage some of that experience to develop programs which are tailored around, say, alcohol and other drugs or mental health as well. On to aim 2, which we met via the GHB cultures, practices, and experiences study. The aim here was to develop evidence to inform the delivery of interventions focused on GHB harm reduction. And we asked this question of how do LGBTQ+ people who use GHB mitigate risks associated with GHB overdose and sexual violence? And what are the associated education priorities for us as community organizations in this space? I want to acknowledge that the population scope of this study is different to GBMSM, which is what I'm mostly talking about in this presentation. We focused on LGBTQ+ populations in this study because the community orgs around this research study really wanted us to have a broader focus. They wanted us to have a broader focus because they were noticing increasing harms among people of all sexualities and genders. And they were also wanting the evidence to inform, I guess, our community level harm reduction education rather than kind of individual level tailored services. So to do this study, we formed a working group. And on our working group, we had representatives from WAC in Western Australia, from Thorn Harbour Health in Victoria, from ACON, as well as consumer reps. We advertised on our partners' social media and our websites. We recruited 31 LGBTQ+ people each, reporting using GHB 3 or more times in the last 12 months. We did semi-structured interviews lasting between 60 and 90 minutes, which were transcribed verbatim. We did a thematic framework analysis of those interviews, and we produced a number of different translation products, including a video summary of the work, harm reduction resources, publications, presentations, and training for our method peer workers, which I'll talk about in a moment. I don't have time to dive into each of the publications arising from this work, but to briefly summarize, the first publication, Controlling for Pleasure and Risk, looked at motivations for GHB use and also strategies in service of GHB overdose prevention. The second publication there, Understanding Attitudes, Practices, and Responses to GHB Overdose, looked at how people understood and perceived GHB overdose, what they did when they observed a GHB overdose among a bystander, and explored their attitudes around calling 000 for help. And the final paper there, Playing at the Edges, Navigating Sexual Boundaries and Narrating Sexual Distress, really looked at how people who use GHB in the context of sex negotiate sexual consent, and then also how they narrate and experience any experiences which might be distressing, and whether or not they label those experiences as sexually violent. The key findings from this work was that, our participants demonstrated a really sound knowledge of GHB overdose prevention practices. So some ones that we promote all the time to community, things like be careful with your measuring of your dosing, space out your dosing, allowing 2 hours between each dose, be very careful with your poly drug use and what you're mixing your GHB with. People were pretty across those things. However, 17 people in the sample reported that they had an personal experience of losing consciousness after using GHB. And we saw in accounts from participants that there was an inconsistent understanding about the differences between GHB, GBL, and 1,4-BD, which actually affects decisions around dosing. We saw inconsistent accounts about the safety of drinking before or after using GHB. There was really variable perceptions about the safety of GHB-induced sleep, and widely a reticence to call 000 in response to GHB-induced sleep or GHB overdose. And we saw in the sample the adoption of many frameworks around discussing sex ahead of time and discussing sexual interest boundaries and limits, but probably less of a practice of continuous consent throughout a sexual encounter. And we saw several people in our sample reporting experiences of others starting or continuing sex with them after they'd lost consciousness when using GHB. And while these experiences were reported as something which was distressing, widely it was really resisted that these experiences should be labeled as sexual violence. So what do we do with this? Well, this has really informed our kind of harm reduction education work at ACON and the other partner organizations around this research program. And the research tells us that we really need to reinforce those effective and safe GHB overdose prevention strategies. That I think we need to acknowledge that there's a reticence to calling 000 in response to a GHB-induced loss of consciousness. And so we need to provide community education on how you manage airways and how you check for breathing, but we also need to encourage 000 call. We need to reinforce practices around facilitating, affirmative consent and negotiating sexual boundaries, and also, promote practices around continuous consent, including nonverbal continuous consent in contexts where GHBs combine with sex. And I think the work also just highlights the service needs of a group of people who might be distressed around some experiences they've had while using GHB, even if they don't name those experiences as non-consent or sexual violence. The work that we did in this study went on to, I've got it here in the flesh, went on to be included in our Method Chemsex harm reduction guide and was used in our training for our Method Chemsex peer workers, which gives me a nice little segue to talk about AIM 3, which is about implementing and formatively evaluating a peer-led Chemsex intervention. So Method was devised in consultation with 16 people, all of whom had lived experience around chemsex or sexualized drug use. It was also devised in consultation with ACON substance support counselors and researchers here at the Kirby. We based the intervention on the stages of change theory, or the trans-theoretical model of behavior change, and it included 3 components: 1, harm reduction education; 2, motivational interviewing; and 3, service navigation. And our peers were trained to, use the stages of change theory to stage match interventions for participants. So for example, if someone was coming through the service and they weren't really interested in, didn't really need to change or reduce behaviors around drug use and chemsex, that person might be at a pre-contemplation stage and then receive a harm reduction education intervention. By contrast, someone coming through the intervention who'd maybe been to services before, was maybe engaged in a process of behavior change, that person might be more at that planning or action stage and may benefit from a motivational interview or a service navigation intervention. We had 3 aims with the service. The first was to support people to reduce harms associated with chemsex. The second was to help people, if they wanted to manage the frequency of chemsex. And the third was to help people to access appropriately affirming services. In terms of its delivery, it was a one-to-one intervention, talk-based intervention, delivered initially to a brief one-time intervention protocol, delivered in person and online. Importantly, it was delivered by 3 peers, each of whom had living experience around chemsex. So a current practice of chemsex versus a historic practice of chemsex. And peers were supported with a training program on the intervention processes, on harm reduction education, motivational interviewing, and service navigation. They also got training in mental health first aid, crisis response, and research administration. They received ongoing support from our team of counsellors at ACON, and they also received a monthly external clinical supervision. The resources pictured there are based on some of the work that was done at 56 Dean Street in London, and essentially they're interactive conversational tools that helped our peers to guide their interventions. If people are interested, you can grab a screen grab of the QR code and have a look in more detail at the type of content that our peers were covering. In terms of the method study, this was a formative evaluation, and it was designed to inform the service's replicability and adaptation. The study period ran between May of 2022 and May of 2023, and it included interviews with participants who were clients of the service, peers, and other staff who were supporting the implementation of method, each of whom completed a 60 to 90-minute interview. And we also had peers collect field notes throughout the implementation via a REDCap form. In terms of how we analyze the data, we did a deductive thematic analysis of our data against Proctor's early stage implementation outcomes, acceptability, feasibility, and appropriateness. We decided to focus on early stage implementation outcomes because this was a novel intervention. There's no efficacy evidence base for it. And we defined these outcomes in alignment with Proctor's definitions, with acceptability being the perception among stakeholders that the intervention was agreeable, palatable, or satisfactory, the appropriateness being the fit or relevance and compatibility of the intervention for ACON setting and intervention clients, and feasibility being the extent to which the intervention could be carried out with a regard for our context, resourcing, and capacity. We used a tidier checklist for complete intervention reporting, and we also used an implementation research logic model, which was used as a tool to map the intervention context, its inputs, the strategies that supported its implementation, and the reasons why we thought those strategies would work. I've included here a very high-level summary of our implementation research logic model for method. And I first came across this implementation research logic model in the Kirby Institute seminar series. So thank you, Tyson and Ben, for organizing that, because I found this extremely helpful. I want to acknowledge that I actually used this implementation research logic model at the stage of analysis. So it was kind of retrospectively used rather than prospectively used. And I think in future, I would like to use this prospectively rather than retrospectively. But I found this useful for two reasons. One was because I just think it helped provide a really useful map of all the different things that were going on with this intervention in terms of context, implementation and strategies, and the intervention itself. But it also just helped me make sense of the data. There was a lot of data between those long interviews and also the peer field notes. And this just gave me a tool through which I could hook different parts of the data onto the concepts addressed in this implementation research logic model, which help punctuate the narrative around acceptability, feasibility, and appropriateness. And hopefully that'll be clear what I mean by that when I actually talk through the narrative around those outcomes. In terms of our participants, now we interviewed 24 participants from community for this study, but we also interviewed 9 staff members, and our 9 staff members were method peer workers, 3 of them, 3 substance support counselors, 2 managers and 1 clinical supervisor. The eligibility for the intervention and the study was GBMSM, or trans and non-binary people reporting sexualized crystal methamphetamine or GHB use within the last 3 months. There's a few things I want to point out about these participant demographics. The first was that we did 53 interventions between May of 22 and May of 23. Now, 53 interventions isn't a terribly low number, but it's nowhere near what we'd hypothesized in terms of intervention uptake. So we really promoted this service via our A-Test sexual health facilities, via Recon, Grindr, social media websites, our NSP services, but we struggled to get the uptake. We also hypothesized that we'd have a high level of uptake for this service among people kind of at that pre-contemplation stage of behavior change who maybe just needed a brief harm reduction education intervention around chemsex. But if you look at these demographics, you can see that 18 out of the 24 people who we interviewed reported that they were currently dependent on crystal methamphetamine. So we were engaging a sort of quite a different client group. And often these people had engaged in services previously and were looking for additional peer support. The other thing I want to note about this is that the ethnicity, we had 21 people who participated in interviews who were Caucasian, and that's just not reflective of the demographic of people who are actually coming through the method service. We struggle to get research uptake among culturally and linguistically diverse participants, but we had a much better intervention uptake among culturally and linguistically diverse participants. So I think that's a real limitation of this research, and I just kind of want to put that up there front and center. So what did we learn about the acceptability of the intervention? Now, really encouragingly, what we learned from our clients was that this, in fact, was quite a meaningful intervention for people. People were coming through the service and saying that it was the first time that they'd ever had a really honest conversation about chemsex with anybody else. They'd said they'd experienced barriers to talking about chemsex with friends who don't engage in chemsex, with service providers, and they'd said that it wasn't always appropriate to do a kind of reflective stock take kind of conversation with somebody else who practices chemsex. So this service was a really valuable outlet for people. And I think some of those sentiments are reflected in Trent's quote here, who says, "I've been HIV positive since 1984, and I've also had a couple of bouts of hepatitis C, and there's a huge stigma attached to that. So the taboo of talking openly about chem use and the stigma against that, you just shut down. So to talk to a peer, that safe place to talk, just helps self-reflection and getting your head around it." So we can see this was quite a meaningful intervention for Trent and many clients who were like Trent. We also investigated the acceptability among our peer workers. And encouragingly for me, the peers felt very enthusiastically and passionately about this intervention and passionately about the positive impacts it was having for their clients. Peers reported that their participation in this intervention had a number of kind of extrinsic benefits associated with being in paid employment, but also a number of intrinsic benefits too, associated kind of with a sense of purpose and self-esteem. And we see some of that reflected in Kevin's quote here, who says, "I think it's facilitated my recovery. And by my recovery, I don't mean I'm completely drug-free these days. It gave me a strong sense of purpose. It's required me to be responsible and accountable daily. And I think knowing that my organization is on my side and my lived experience is valued to whatever degree, that has really helped me to take ownership of my drug use, to take ownership of my trauma, to all kinds of experience in the past and just move on." So this was a really encouraging sentiment shared by Kevin and also by the other two peer workers who were employed to work on this program. We explored the acceptability of the intervention among partnering clinicians. Often a topic in peer interventions is this peer and clinician integration. And our substance support counsellors at ACON were very supportive of the intervention in terms of providing training and debriefing to our peer workers. But before, when I mentioned that we struggled to kind of get client uptake for a long while, we also didn't get a lot of referrals from our substance support counselling service into this intervention. And so in our interviews, I kind of wanted to explore what that was all about. And what I heard back from the counsellors was that there was a perception that this intervention was a brief intervention focusing on harm reduction. So it wasn't always appropriate for their clients. And I think that probably was accurate considering how we pitched this intervention initially. There was also a sense that they didn't quite have confidence or knowledge about what the intervention actually included, and that they needed that transparency in order to trust the peer workers enough to actually refer a client to their services. And this is reflected in Alex's comment here, who said, that's probably where some of the tension is as well. It's a bit of a mystery for us, We don't have a clear sense of what that conversation is that a peer has with a client. So this told us that we really needed to work on that peer and clinician integration. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how we did that when I wrap up. We had so much data on appropriateness for this intervention, which I'm going to try and summarize in 2 slides. There is a paper coming out on all of this, which details this in much more detail, but I've segmented the data on appropriateness into 3 subheadings here. The first being the content, the second being peer identity, and the third being the brief intervention protocol. So we saw in our peer field notes that content was being delivered across all the different modes of delivery, with 23 harm reduction interventions, 41 motivational interviews, and 20 instances of service navigation. We also saw in feedback from clients that they appreciated different components of that content for different purposes. So we felt that the content was appropriate. People provided a lot of reflections on peer identity, and broadly it was reflected that working with a peer with living experience aided a sense of kind of reciprocity and validation, by contrast to working with a peer with a past experience. So people valued that kind of current living experience approach. Interestingly, older participants in our study said that they were absolutely not comfortable and did not want to work with younger peers. And they said they didn't want to do that because of, I guess, like generational divides, and also kind of, I guess, ageism in the gay community. But also they talked about their experience of long-term relationships, their experiences of the early years of the HIV epidemic. And they just sort of said, I would really struggle to connect with a peer who was much younger than me to talk about this type of content. Luckily for us, we had an older peer worker, and so we did a lot of that kind of identity matching around age. The third thing was around this brief intervention protocol. Now, I mentioned earlier that we thought about this as a harm reduction intervention, a brief intervention. Overwhelmingly, this brief intervention was rejected by our peer workers and also by the clients who were coming through the service. People had this experience of coming to Method, having a really affirming experience with the peer, an experience of connection, and ultimately wanting that experience to continue over time. People had sort of more robust service and support needs than just a one-time harm reduction education intervention. And I think the impact of this is reflected nicely by Thomas's quote here, who says, I was a little bit disappointed that we didn't have a follow-up meeting. I thought, wow, he's just done. He's just ticked the box and I'm out. It was like I was auditioning for attention. So I asked him, it would have been good for you if it had been said, do you want to come back and see me in a couple of weeks? And Thomas replied, no, not do you want to, but I'd like to see you. I think that might make a difference. Now, when interpreting this quote, I kind of want to keep it front of mind that a lot of people who are coming through this intervention reported in their interviews experiences around social isolation and loneliness, and also experiences of a very poor self-esteem. I think it's also important for us to note that this intervention existed in explicit relation to a kind of gay social and sexual marketplace where people have sensitive experiences around transaction and rejection. And in this instance, the one-time brief intervention protocol was kind of internalized as another rejection. And we got a lot of feedback from our clients that they wanted to keep working with peers over multiple sessions. So we scrapped the one-time intervention protocol fairly early on into implementation. It just didn't work. In terms of the feasibility, this was a feasible intervention, but I'd say that with acknowledgement that ACON's a fairly well-resourced setting. So we had research funding to support this intervention. It was really key for us to recruit a team of peer workers, not just one peer worker, and to provide that peer many opportunities to debrief. This importance is reflected by Billy, who says, you're playing in a space that can be very challenging and complex in many ways. Organizations need to care for their staff in this space, overcare for their peers, give them a buddy system, give them multiple contacts. I can see things going really wrong if an organization tried to develop something like this and let that peer just kind of go off on their own, maybe with one contact. So that to me speaks to the need for like extensive pastoral care for peer workers and resourcing to support that. Community trust in ACON also facilitated service access and facilitated feasibility. And having on-site clinicians also helped with our feasibility for this as well. On 2 occasions, we needed to do an immediate crisis response in that year, and the on-site clinicians were really key in that process. And also they provided ongoing training for our peer workers. I'm going to finish by talking about AIM 4, which is about describing service experiences. So briefly, I mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of research about barriers to service access among GBMSM practicing Chemsex. And barriers to service access are associated with a perception that services might lack appropriate expertise, or that the sexual context of drivers of drug use might be stigmatized in traditional service settings. So we asked 24 participants who participated in our method study interviews, what were your prior service experiences? And we conducted a kind of secondary analysis of that data. We saw 13 of our participants had previously engaged in services, talk therapies for the general population, which I'll refer to as mainstream services, and 15 had previously engaged in services at settings where you would expect there to be a high caseload of GBMSM practicing Chemsex. The participants against this study, in this part of the study, they told us that when they went to services, they near unanimously had a treatment goal of wanting to reduce their practice of Chemsex. And what came out very clearly in their narration of this was that they had experienced this interlinked relationship between drugs and sex, which acted as an inhibitor to them achieving their treatment goal. I'm going to characterize this interlinked relationship between drugs and sex with a number of quotes. So Leandro says, for me, the thing with meth is it's always related to sex. I don't do it for another purpose. Yeah, porn, sex, one thing is related to another. Dimitri says, I can count on one hand the amount of times I've had sober sex, and I'm someone who has a lot of sex. And the only reason why I eject is because one of the sex acts I enjoy is fisting, and I find it impossible to do without injecting. And so because many of my regulars now, that's how they know me, right? There's like no way I could do that sober. And then Jason says, one of the problems with my ex was that when I was sort of weaning us off usage, I found it difficult to be physically intimate with him, which was a terrible thing. Jason's referring to his romantic relationship. So we saw this interlinked relationship between drugs and sex, which was expressed in relation to concepts of everyday sexual stimulus, sexual identity, sexual networks, sexual behaviors, and also intimate relationships. And the impact of this interlinked relationship was that it was said to adversely affect people's ability to reduce their practice of drug use. This is captured by Sebastian, who said, I always used to say, if I can learn to have sober sex, my battle has been won, because then I don't need the drugs, because I'm using the drugs to have sex, and to have sex is a human need. To want to have sex is a human need. So we talked to people about this and said, well, when you went to services, how did you work through this? What was that experience like? And invariably the feedback we heard was, it didn't come up. I didn't feel comfortable to mention it. I sort of mentioned the context in which I was using drugs, but there's no way I could talk about the full extent of it. Or it was a drug service, or it was a psychology mental health service. It wasn't appropriate for me to talk about the sexual drivers of my substance use in that service. This is captured by Robbie, who says, talking about when he goes to services, it's so focused on drug use and not the sex side of it, which, like, for me, when I think of the biggest reasons why I find it hard to give up, it's not because I want to have drugs every weekend. It's like, if I'm not having drugs, I won't have sex. And there's no conversation about sex as a trigger in itself. And I mean, yes, drugs are the health issue, not sex. But what I need help with is talking to someone about how I get the confidence to have sex when not on drugs. I find whenever you ask for help, it's solely about reducing drug use, but they go hand in hand. This was really commonly articulated in our sample, and it kind of left me with a question of, well, what do you actually do to address this interlinked relationship between drugs and sex? And I luckily had the opportunity to ask our substance support counselors at ACON what they do around this presentation. And we provide a lot of education for service providers around this, using this data now. But the first thing our substance support counselors said to us was that you absolutely have to ask about sex, that people experience a lot of shame associated with drug use and a lot of shame associated with sex. It's a very vulnerable and personal thing for somebody to bring that up in a service context, and they won't do it unless you proactively ask about it. The next thing they told us was about really empathizing with the process of grief, about stepping away from sexualized drug use. Now, I think people who work in drug and alcohol services deal with this process of grief quite a lot, but there's a sexual component with this particular client group. And so there was an acknowledgement that we need to work with, experiences of stepping away from sexual networks, from sexual partners, and from sexual identities. Our counselors also talked to us about the need for clients to develop a sexual identity in a sexual context outside of the context of drug use. And they said they work with people around this by, in session, affirming sex positivity and affirming diversity of sexual practices and preferences. They also work with clients to help them explore and understand where they learnt and internalized sexual shame. And they use therapy time to reflect on, identify, and practice sexual wants and needs. This developing sexual identity and confidence section is really in recognition of the fact that when you use drugs to have sex, that really fast tracks your access to sexual experiences, which can be extremely gratifying and affirming. And, you know, there needs to be a framework that we can work towards to gain those experiences outside of the context of drug use. The next thing substance support counselors spoke to us about was about reframing your expectations. So challenging expectations of immediate adventure with new partners and acknowledging that when you have sex without drugs, it takes a while for those things to build up. Educate on the physical limitations of sex without drugs. Invite people not to compare sex on drugs to sex without drugs. And acknowledge that sex without drugs actually affords a different range of possibilities associated with building relationships over time, engaging with a different type of softness or a different type of intimacy or a different type of connection. So that's the data that I wanted to present to you. We've translated this into a bunch of different products. We did a video summary of our GHB findings. We've produced a number of resources from our GHB study findings and resources to train our Chemsex peer workers. We also developed an inclusive practices guideline for AOD and mental health services here in New South Wales in partnership with NADA and the Mental Health Coordinating Council. The data led us to adapt many things about our method service. We altered our protocol to enable peers to work with people ongoing rather than once off. And to support that, we needed to kind of encourage this, I guess, a closer peer and clinician integration. So we moved our peer workers to co-locate at ACON with our client services team and to attend client services team meetings. And that supported that peer and clinician integration. But what else supported this peer and clinician integration was the development of a method group workshop program. Group workshop program supported that peer and clinician integration because it was facilitated by a substance support counselor and a method peer. But it also, I guess, met clients' needs around kind of ongoing community connection and engagement. The impact of this is that in the last financial year, our number of clients and occasions of service doubled. ACON's now investing in the delivery of the intervention ongoing and is currently recruiting additional peer workers. And this was a quote from one of our participants who went through our group work program recently. And he said, "This has been such a great support. It's given me a great set of tools for my toolbox to allow me to grow and to allow me to become the best version of myself. I thought I would be judged, but it's been beautiful to be in a room of people who've been in the same shoes and to have all the support of the people who've gone through it. It's been life-changing." So it's really nice to hear that feedback about the group work program. I'm going to summarize now. And at the start of this presentation, I asked this question about how may community-led interventions best support GBMSM to manage Chemsex. And I suggested that there's 3 principles or recommendations which are recommended for, I guess, quality and robust services in this space. I think my findings ultimately affirm these recommendations that services should prioritize harm reduction, incorporate lived experience, and provide interdisciplinary support. But I think the findings also provide a little bit of additional nuance about the application of these principles in practice. So there's an ongoing priority to deliver harm reduction interventions addressing GHB overdose and also addressing sexual consent communication. I think peer-led Chemsex services are very meaningful in this space. They're acceptable to a range of stakeholders. They don't need to be limited or curtailed to brief interventions, but peers need to be supported with robust training, multiple avenues of pastoral care and supervision, and that providers of drug and alcohol mental health services who are working with people who practice Chemsex may benefit from tailored education regarding support for people who experience this bidirectional and interlinked relationship between drugs and sex. There's so many people that I need to thank around this research. The first is to the 64 people who participated in the interviews. I'm very grateful to you. I learned a lot through this research process. To the method team led by Bo-Justin Zhao, who's here today. Thank you so much, Bo-Justin. You've been delightful to work with. To my supervisors, Mo, Krista, Garrett, and Adam. There was a range of CIs listed on publications arising from this thesis, and I'd like to thank all of them. Some different organizations whose logos are represented on that slide supported this research too. But I want to especially thank the team at ACON with special mention of Matt Vaughan, Carl Johnson and Joel Murray, who really supported this work extensively. So thank you so much. Happy to have questions.
Just under 10 minutes for questions. For people in the room, if you want to run to either microphone, see Philip about to jump up. Oh, yeah, online questions.
Yeah, go.
Well, look, first of all, Jack, congratulations. I mean, that was an amazing presentation. It's clearly an amazing body of work, really brave and really great to see so much rigor brought to, this sort of work. But I guess I was interested in what you said at the beginning about how I think in the 2010s, crystal methamphetamine in particular was really demonized as well as GHB. I guess it seems to me it makes ACON quite brave in terms of, embarking on and proceeding with this sort of work. I think that atmosphere must have really inhibited a lot of organisations from really addressing the need as you explained it and saw it. But I wondered whether you could say something about the extent to which that has changed in Australia or elsewhere. Is this sort of approach more accepted in Australia generally or in other settings?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there was a deal of anxiety at ACON about venturing into this type of work back when we first ventured into it in about 2020. I also mentioned at the start there that in New South Wales, there'd been this special commission of inquiry into the drug ice. Now, the recommendations that arose from that inquiry had a lot to do with peer programs and community-led programs. And I think that significantly changed the political landscape that existed around this service delivery. But also internally at ACON, I think that there's been a change over the last 4 years whereby historically we've done a lot of peer programs in kind of a group work space or a kind of community education space, or even in ATES, kind of a clinical services space. We've seen a growth in peer programs at ACON where it's kind of more one-to-one talk-based therapies in mental health, our trans health equity team as well. And I think that this service delivery was kind of caught up in that momentum too. And I think organizationally, we're much more comfortable working in that terrain now. I think that answers your question. Anything else? Other settings? How do you mean?
Have other settings been able to do this sort of work, or are they?
So I think I want to acknowledge that like peer work exists in the AOD sector, definitely. And there's peer roles in a bunch of different AOD organizations and hospitals. I think it's more of an emerging workforce by comparison to, say, the mental health workforce. And I think for ACON, this type of intervention was a kind of new practice for us. And I know that similar types of interventions, like Chemsex specific interventions, exist globally. A lot of this work was initially inspired by a program of work that was going on at 56 Dean Street in London. That intervention at 56 Dean Street in London had a very high level of uptake, but it hasn't been documented kind of in the peer-reviewed literature. And so that was a bit of a motivation for us in doing this program of work too. So the work does exist in other settings, but probably not as documented as we've had the fortunate ability to be able to. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation, Jack. Really enjoyed it. Is there any tension out there in the land of funders between, the approach to these very specific population issues and funding mainstream versus, population-specific services? I'm thinking of drug and alcohol services, and it can be tempting for funders to say drive people towards the mainstream. Do you think this might help challenge that thinking?
I would love it if it did. I think that is fair to say, Andrew. Yeah, I guess I can really only speak from my experience at ACON. And at ACON, we were always advocating for inclusive and affirming mainstream services, but also for our patch in tailored service delivery. And I think it's telling that we were able to really invest in this service development and delivery because we got research funding. So we didn't get another funding stream for this. Obviously, we get a funding stream for our substance support counselling program, which we're very grateful for. But I do think that, LGBTQ plus populations don't take pride of place in the AOD sector in the same way that they do in other sectors like HIV, you know, probably for obvious reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got time for more.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, two completely different questions. First, you mentioned at the start about that the Chemsex experience was not exclusively a gay bisexual men thing, but do we have any data on what the sort of rates of, because a high proportion of people in gay and bisexual men surveys do report, I mean, it's 10% or 15%, or but do we have any information on those percentages in heterosexual populations?
I can't speak to that, I'm afraid, off the top of my head. I know I often look at the kind of data from the Kirby Institute Trans and Gender Diverse Sexual Health Survey from 2018. And in that survey, we saw that 15.8% of participants in that study reported sexualized drug use in the last, I think, 12 months. Yeah. There wasn't information about kind of what the drugs were. So yeah, look, I'm not sure. I can't.
Has there been, have there been any, I don't know if there's been any surveys on that question. I don't know if it was in the ASHA survey, or, I'm not sure. But a completely different question on the, I was actually thinking all the way through it until you got to the end about that whole point about the role of drugs in sex. No, I mean, it's not just about drugs, it's about that two-way interaction. Does the counselling process try to unpack those different reasons, or and incorporate that into the counselling? Because obviously, with any drug and alcohol use, there's, you know, can be anything from just general disinhibition through to specific, you know, perceptions of the experience, through to performance, all this. I mean, there's many different factors. Does the counselling process try to unpack those for the individual?
So I would say that certainly ACON substance support counselling process does engage with that and unpacking all those different processes for the individual. With regards to the method intervention specifically, you know, we didn't go into that level of detail with clients, but instead, I guess, provided a referral. But certainly, yeah, our substance support counsellors would dissect a lot of those different motivations and how they play out. Yeah.
That's all the time we have. Everyone, help me thank.